So we're in the last section of chapter 3, and we're going to be talking about the government in the colonies. Okay, well, the government in the colonies was quite different in the different colonies because of the type of colony they were. Now, of course, they weren't states yet. They weren't in the United States, so they had no central government ruling them. So when we talk about government, the government was depending on what kind of colony and who ruled the colony. So we're going to talk about important presidents, colonial government, the legislators, the governors, and the courts. Just a quick review of this, because you'll be getting this later on, especially after the United States becomes a country. So what kind of government was going on in these days? Talking about important precedents. So there are a lot of precedents in England. Of course, England, we know it had certain peculiarities that were different from American government. But in England, they would have more of common law. Americans, much was accepted in tradition of British. The British knew this is the way we do it. Everything's common. This goes, way back to the Magna Carta. This is how we run with the Parliament and everything, and this is how it goes. But Americans preferred to have everything written down. Why do you think? Because if they didn't have it written down, then it wouldn't be liable to them. If they didn't have it written down, England would not accept it, right? So they believed they should have charters on how to run things. So they wanted things written down in detail in America, which in England they didn't. Each different colony wanted to have a written charter with a comprehensive constitution, so that they could know exactly how they needed to rule and what ways England could not control them too. So this would be very important later on when America became a nation, these different charters and what was happening with these charters, especially when some of the kings wanted to do away with all these charters. So here we have under William and Mary Charter, we have William Penn's charter, we have the Virginia Charter. There was a lot of charters, and a lot of them were taken away at certain times we'll find out a lot of them, the charters were a little different than the proprietary, depending on which colonies. So let's talk about that. There are 3 types of colonial government. First, we had the royal colonies. They were directed by the authority of the King of England. They didn't have a charter necessarily. Well, we say some of them did have a charter from the King of England, but the authority went right to the king, right? There were 8 of these colonies. Virginia was a royal colony, Massachusetts, New Hampshire, North and South Carolina, New York, New Jersey, and Georgia. They all turned into royal colonies, 8 of them. And then we had proprietary colonies. Now, some of these colonies before started out being proprietary colonies, and they ended up being royal colonies, like Georgia. So, but now, towards the end of this time period, the proprietary colonies were granted by the king to an individual. Right at this time, we have 3 main proprietary colonies, being Maryland. Remember the Calverts of Maryland, that they were Catholic, and they wanted Maryland to be a Catholic colony, and they were controlled. They felt they were in control. In Pennsylvania, we have William Penn and the Quakers, and he set for the propriety of Pennsylvania. He founded it. He was actually, the king gave it to him to repay his dad's debt that he owed his dad, and he ended up with Pennsylvania as a proprietary colony. And Delaware is another one, but Delaware was actually William Penn's too. So Pennsylvania and Delaware were like hooked together. So those are proprietary colonies. So they were ruled a little different by a proprietor, not necessarily directly to the king. And then we had the self-governing ones that were allowed to self-govern, that they definitely would have charters, and they had their constitutions. And Rhode Island and Connecticut were those 2. Rhode Island had its charter from Constitution from the beginning, and Connecticut, actually, they wanted to take the Connecticut Constitution. One of the, I think it was King Charles the second, well, I wanted to take the Connecticut charter away from Connecticut, and they hid it in the Charter Oak, remember? So that they hid it away, so they actually still had their charter. They couldn't get it taken away because the English couldn't find it. It was underneath an oak tree. So here we have pictures of, this is Peter Zenglers' trial with Alexander Hamilton here. I don't know why I put it there, but it's actually probably on the wrong slide. I should have put it earlier, but you see there, that's a type of the judicial system in the government. The legislators. Legislators are the branch of government that make the laws. Well, in most of these colonies, they had legislators that were called bicameral. If unicameral means that they only had one House of Representatives, one house. Bicameral means they had two houses. So, and all except Pennsylvania were bicameral. They had two houses. That's what we have. Now we have two houses, right? We have the Senate and we have the House of Representatives. That's what we have in America. Well, it started in these small colonies. They would have two houses. The upper house would be small, and it would have like 12 to 18 members, and it would be appointed by the king. And it would be an advisory body to govern or to make laws. These guys the king knew, and we're going to control, so he'd give them, the upper house would be his guys there, so that he would have them be in charge of the laws. And then the lower house was elected by the voters. And the lower house would have 50 to 75% of the adult male voters. And only 10% in Great Britain, but the male voters in America, they wanted to vote, and they'd be 50 to 75%. Most of these guys were middle-class farmers and merchants, and they had the power to control taxes and government. That's important because they actually, they could control the government spending, but they could control the governor's salary. So in that way, the governor up here, they didn't like their governor, they would lower his salary, how much money he'd get, and he wouldn't like it. So that was important. So the advantages here of the bicameral system, the two houses, that allows representative of both population and region, and it they balance each other. So there's not one power, although we know the power actually went to the king in this time. And it guards against impulsive legislative, I guess. But now, because these guys in the upper house were appointed by the crown, the king felt that he definitely had control. Little parliament? No, kind of, we'll see, a little different. The difference in England is that England always represented the nation as a whole. In the colonies, they were representing the colonies, right? And they were never bound to obey. In England, they were never bound to, in England, they never were bound to obey their local interests or at the expense of national policy. So everything, the parliament in England was always for the nation. It never was for the local interests at all. In America, the representatives, or deputies they called them, were sent by people of their districts. Because there are so many different districts, they're too numerous, they would have to send representatives, and they were representing the needs of the people that lived there. So this was indirectly a government by the people. It's called republic type of government with representatives. So here we have pictures. So they weren't little parliaments. The parliament in England always represented only the needs of the nation as a whole, not as individuals. Colonial governors. Here's some pictures of some of the governors here. The governors, they were at this time appointed by who? By the government of England, right? By the king. Each colony had a governor who was the chief executive. The royal colonies were appointed, these governors were appointed by the crown or by a proprietor, but the proprietor was appointed by the king or the crown. The self-governing colonies were elected by the people. They were the only ones that were really elected. The governors were elected by the people. Most of the governors were appointed by the king or by a proprietor. Well, the governor had such great power. He had power to summon and dismiss the legislative assembly. So if they would start to assemble the assembly there, say, okay, we're going to all assembly here, he could say, no, we're not. We're going to dismiss it. He had absolute veto. So that meant if they took a law, the people brought a law, and he could just say, nope, I veto it. Nope, that law is not going to happen. Absolute veto. He was commander-in-chief of the military, of the militia. So he controlled the militia. He also was head of the church, especially in Massachusetts. He was the head of the church. And he was also the head of the courts of the last resort. So he had so much power. The way that his power was limited, and I mentioned it before, was by appropriating funds for the governor's salary. So the only way that people could is that they wanted to get a government out, they would decrease his salary. Now, if the governor didn't care about his salary, say that he was wealthy enough, he didn't need a salary, he could be in there a long time. But if he did care, there'd be the power of the purse. Say, we're going to quit paying our governor, maybe he'll go away. So, but these were royal, usually royalty because they were appointed by the king. Colonial courts too. Well, this is the last part I'm going to talk about is the courts. The courts were not good, even in America, because they were modeled after England and controlled by England. So not until America became a nation did it focus on the judiciary. Judiciary means court system. So most of the power of the court was with the governor, as you saw before, in the upper house. The people didn't have a lot of clout, in the judicial courts back then, because a lot of them were focused mainly on what? Mainly on England. And we'll say this is actually one of the needs for independence, is that they would have fair courts in America, because the courts were not fair because they were controlled by the royal governors, right? And so they were not even mature yet until America became independent. So I think one of these was this is Continental Congress or something. Oh, here's a picture of they look like their parliament, right? So they'd bring in the judicial court that looked like the parliament in England and acted like the parliament in England at that point, so as the courts in England kind of copied them at this point, until later on that would be changed. So anyway, that's the end of chapter 3. So we're going to go on. We'll get into the independence and why America wanted to be independent of England. You can see some of the needs right here with the court system, right? So let's stop there.